This is a really quick summary to highlight the difference between the two situational explanations for obedience, which are agentic state and legitimacy of authority. Students tend to merge them into one and to get them confused. Although there is some overlap, you want to be clear, especially in the AO3 link back, which of the two explanations you're evaluating and what aspect of that explanation you're evaluating. So let's look at a quick summary of AO1 and AO3 for these two explanations side to side to highlight the differences. So the agentic state is something to do with the individual. The individual cognitively makes a shift in the way they think of themselves, not as representing themselves in their action, but in representing the authority figure. So that's what happens. An authority figure is present, they're close, and they have status, and therefore a person feels that they don't have a choice whether they agree with the order or not. There's a shift, and they think whatever they do is no longer their personal responsibility. This is increased by what we know as binding factors over here, that are factors in the situation that make people more likely to minimize the feeling of responsibility. So for example, if the authority figure is very close, then it's easy to say, well, they were right there, they were looking at me, I didn't feel I have a choice. They have authority, they can do so. That's why not seeing the consequence of your action might also make you more likely to shift into an agentic state. If we think of Milgram's original setup, there was a wall between the teacher and the learner, meaning that it was easy not to take personal responsibility because you couldn't see the outcome of your actions. We know from variations that when the proximity was reduced and the person could see the effect of administering a shock, they were less likely to obey because it was harder to experience that agentic shift when they were actually touching the person and seeing them being electrocuted. So these are binding factors. You want to include them as an aspect that facilitates an agentic shift. On the other hand, legitimacy of authority is more to do not with the individual obeying, but with the individual with authority. What are the signs that their authority is justified? The premise of legitimacy of authority is that as a society, we have a specific social order that allows everything to function. For example, if you obey a policeman, you're more likely to be safe. So the idea is that authority is justified in their requests, and therefore we don't question them, we just obey because we want to maintain social order. Okay, so that's a more societal expectation, and you'll see that's why legitimacy of authority lends itself more to a question of culture bias, because some cultures might be more firm and less flexible in whether one would question an authority figure or not, and that starts straight from kind of parenting styles at a young age. So there are three elements of the legitimacy of authority: the legitimacy of the system, so the system that people are operating in, does it assign legitimacy to their position? For example, if someone is the leader, but the leader of some kind of new age cult, most people would not see that authority as legitimate because it's a system that can be very questionable. Legitimacy of the status of the authority, that's what's most linked to uniform. What stage in the hierarchy, how high in the hierarchy as a person might be signposted by what they're wearing. For example, even in a school, the head teacher might always be in a suit, whereas other teachers lower in the status might just wear a shirt and a tie, for example. So how high up is their status within the system? And the last point is the legitimacy of the demands. If a teacher asks you to do your homework, that's a legitimate demand. But if a teacher asks you to not wear red because she doesn't like that color, then that is not a legitimate. You can't really justify her position within the system, doesn't warrant that kind of order. And that's why we'll see that the fact that the demands in Milgram went from reasonable to unreasonable made people more likely to obey. So now we're going to move on to the AO3s. I'm going to look at which variations are more relevant to agentic state or legitimacy of authority. For example, the orders over the phone variation, and as I said, you've also got the touch proximity variation. Those would be both relevant to agentic state because it's reducing the strain, the moral strain. It's providing a binding factor. So when the person is there physically, you've got a 65% obedience rate because people don't feel a personal responsibility. They don't feel the moral strain. As you remove that and the person gives the order by phone, they're no more physically there, the obedience drops because there are less binding factors. It's harder to attribute the responsibility to someone who isn't there in the room with you. Okay? The other research to support agentic state is more based on self-report or report from others. Both the people taking part in the experiment, in the follow-up by Milgram and Elms, they said that they didn't take responsibility, the ones who obeyed, but also in a study by Blass and Schmidt where they asked people to watch the footage of Milgram's original study and then asked them who they felt was responsible. Most of them attributed the responsibility to the experimenter, to the person in the white gown, rather than to the participants. So that's agentic state. The other variations seem to be more attributable to legitimacy of authority. And when you link them back, you want to link them back to where the variation is more relevant to the legitimacy of the orders, of the system, or of the authority figure themselves. So, for example, the uniform variation is relevant to the legitimacy of the status of the individual within that hierarchy, as we mentioned before, what they're wearing signposts how high up in the hierarchy they might be. And that's Bickman's study as well, milkman's suit and police uniform, gradually higher and higher status in maintaining social order, and aligned with that there was more obedience to the suited man compared to the milkman, and then to the police uniform compared to the suit. So hierarchically higher correlates with higher levels of obedience. The location variation, however, relates to the legitimacy of the system rather than the status, because it's the place in which the orders take place that attributes, that it justifies the obedience less, and that's why we have a drop in obedience in a rundown office. As I said, the orders going from reasonable to unreasonable is the legitimacy of the demands, because initially the demands seem to be reasonable and therefore justified. Yeah, a little electric shock, that's quite common in psychological experiments, even in conditioning, Skinner's rats. So it seemed to be a legitimate order. Now, as they gradually increased, it became unreasonable, but by then, and this is where these two explanations can kind of come together, the person had shifted into an agentic state. They were no longer feeling responsible for their actions. They thought that it was justified, and therefore they went along. So you see, it's easy to get these confused, but first you have to clarify the differences, and then you can appreciate how they interact with each other. The last point, as I mentioned before, for legitimacy of authority is pointing out that the question of how legitimate, how justified an authority figure might be is influenced by cultural factors. For example, we've got an example of Milgram's study replicated in Australia, having much higher levels of disobedience compared to replications in Germany, showing that cultural expectations and beliefs interact with this legitimacy of authority, meaning that legitimacy of authority alone cannot help us predict whether someone will obey or not. We also have to look at cultural factors. And then at the bottom, you can see here that you've got factors that are relevant to both legitimacy of authority and agentic state. Both of them overlook personality variables, so for example, locus of control or authoritarian personality, and both also have legal implications. Both of them take a deterministic view, meaning that legally people might use this as a justification for carrying out atrocities. For example, it was the main line of defense of Nazi soldiers defending what they had carried out in World War II. So these are the key points. It's all very condensed here. If you want more detail, I can make more detailed PowerPoints on each one of these. Let me know.